Anyway, as Wendy said today, this is more of a slideshow than a lecture. I'm going to show you some pictures and tell you how I went about making them. As in all slideshows, I have to warn you, mine have been known to put people to sleep. In fact, I've become drowsy in some of my slideshows. So if you feel like nodding off, feel free to do that later on. In 1978, I was just getting started as a young freelance photographer in Chicago to take a few assignments from Life magazine. The year before, my wife and I had moved our two daughters into an apartment building on the north side of Chicago. It was a 3-flat. The landlord was on the top floor, we were on the bottom floor. In the middle was Gerald Moore and his wife. As luck would have it, Gerald was the Chicago bureau chief for Life magazine. We became friends, and that was my entree to getting assignments for Life. One day in May, Gerald called and said, "Are you free this Saturday?" And he had a list of photographers that he could call, established photographers, and he knew that I knew that he had called everybody on that list and finally had called me. He also knew that if I wasn't free on Saturday, I would get free. The assignment was kind of a down and dirty thing. It was to go downtown and shoot some pictures, get on a plane, go to Indianapolis, shoot some pictures, get back to O'Hare in time to get the film off to New York. Oh, this is not going. So something is happening here I don't understand. Anyway, you will remember that 1968 was an election year. And this was also the year that celebrities had started to endorse candidates of their choice. So here you can see, Sammy Davis, who was appearing at the Shubert Theater downtown. He was endorsing Bobby Kennedy. When I arrived there, there was something going on in the alley and Sammy wasn't happy. There was too much hairspray or too much exhaust, and he wanted to save his voice for the show. So we went inside to his dressing room. And here you can see, those of you who know, that I had the wrong film in the camera for indoor lighting. So I was trying to correct that by bouncing a strobe, my mighty light, off the ceiling and making the colors more realistic. So with that, I got a nice picture of Sammy, but it's just a picture of Sammy. I like the cigarette holder, but there's no Bobby Kennedy here. So we get ourselves together, go back out, and the Kennedy people had come up with some posters. So I grabbed this shot of Sammy and was off to O'Hare. I flew to Indianapolis, where I was to meet someone on the street corner in a station wagon, and we were going to go around together to endorse McCarthy. As you can see, here's the McCarthy guy. He's keeping the fan back a little bit from the celebrity, and the celebrity, of course, was Paul Newman, who endorsed McCarthy. We rode around town in a station wagon with a cooler of Budweiser. Paul kept one in his hand between stops. And he would jump out and get on the tailgate where he's standing now and talk to the crowd. The crowds were kind of assembled by the McCarthy people, or just people walked up to see what was happening. And I really do look at the main person when I'm taking a picture, but also later I see this face in a crowd, which is something that I enjoy about looking at my pictures, seeing details that I never saw when I took the picture. This is one view of Paul from standing up, and you see this wine store. And here I was probably a block away with a longer lens to just give a different view. Paul was a terrific guy. He was casual. He didn't seem to be too impressed with himself. He was easygoing. And when he was talking to the guys in the neighborhood, they were listening to him instead of mugging for the camera, which often happened. But he was very likable and easy to work with. We would go to maybe a laundromat where they had taped up a McCarthy poster, and he would talk for 5 minutes and we would go on to the next stop. Here we are at the press conference, which they had arranged for us. It's interesting, in those days, 1968, you could still smoke in press conferences. Here's a guy with his 16mm film shooting candids, and here's this big sound camera that he's going to have on TV that night. I was very relieved to see this scene because the lights in the film matched up for me. There was plenty of light and there was plenty of color. So I was kind of starting to relax, although I didn't think I'd made any really good pictures yet. But I said, what I need to do is get Paul and McCarthy in the same shot. So here I'm doing that. These other guys are there and these wires are here. So I took a longer lens and I got Paul and McCarthy in this really creepy shot of McCarthy like a big brother. And so I moved myself, I think, to the right and got McCarthy out of there, got the color there. And then I sent this film back to New York, hadn't seen it. And then the next time I saw it, it was a cover, which I was ecstatic about because you got paid an extra $1,000 for a cover. The next politician that I photographed was Bobby Kennedy. And excuse me, life had assigned one photographer. I'm getting messages. Maybe you can't hear me now. I'll see. We hear you started up. Okay. They had assigned one photographer to shoot the whole campaign, Bill Epridge, and Bill needed some R&R. So they said, when Bobby comes to Chicago, you get with the campaign and follow him through Nebraska. And then Bill will pick him up from there. So I met Bobby downtown. This is State Street, I'm pretty sure, Chicago. And we always did shoot an establishing shot, something wide to see where you were, but the more interesting pictures were closer in on the crowd. And this is a frame that I've always liked. I think these two girls are sisters. They may or may not be, but just all of the faces that are smiling. And then this guy with a terrific smile over here, and this kid looking at me. On the campaign, you would do anything you could to try to tell the story of what was happening. So you might make a picture like this that would tell you how many people were there and how close they were. But it was never as interesting to me as being close to the candidate and close to the people that were helping him at any given event. Here again, faces that are interesting. I have no idea what these ladies are thinking, but she's obviously interested. She's undecided and just being there, and she's very curious. But that may or may not be true, but as it's my prerogative to make these guesses about these pictures, and I really do like doing that. There's nothing like being close to somebody when you're photographing them. That's Stanley Tredick here for Look magazine photographing me with a Leica. And I promise you that's a 21mm lens. He's looking through the viewfinder. And I had the better frame of Bobby this time, but Bobby probably wheeled around and gave Stan a great picture too. Stan was a wonderful guy and very, very helpful to me on my first campaign. He was a very seasoned photographer. Again, in the crowd, Bobby would wade in. That's John Glenn behind him. And like what, 5 people holding, trying to shake his hand at once. And then here's a fellow photographer with a brownie. I love that. And then this guy was his serious photographer with his special camera waiting for the moment when Bobby would turn to him. But this is where you like to be when you were shooting, is 3 to 5 feet away with a wide angle lens. Another scene of photographers, I always like seeing them, see fellow photographers, Instamatics. This guy does have an Instamatic. This guy, of course, is Secret Service. Always shaking hands. Kennedy loved to be touching people over and over and over. And it didn't seem so dangerous at that point. He would get out and get into the crowds. We traveled through Nebraska in a motorcade, and I was in the car with Stan and probably somebody from UPS or AP or maybe Saturday Evening Post. And we would go place to place. And I'm sure that the Secret Service was driving. He was Secret Service. He was definitely Secret Service, and he was probably Secret Service. We visited Boys Town, which is a suburb, I believe, of Omaha, and it was very exciting for people. The bus behind had all the writers and reporters, and the photographers got in the car so we could make the pictures. It was just a really easy, wonderful campaign to shoot. It was springtime. It was natural light, which is easy. One day when riding down some of the back roads, I just had this moment where I realized I was so happy to be in that car. And there was nowhere else in the world I wanted to be at that time. And somehow that was really important to realize that, because I knew I was a little in over my head with all of this, but somehow it felt comfortable. And just to realize that was a really important moment in my career at that point. Bobby traveled with his dog Freckles, and he had a little speech that he gave when he was about ready to end his talk. And one of the writers said, the quote was from George Bernard Shaw, and it went like this: "You see things as they are, you say why, but I dream things that would never were, and I say why not." And Bobby would say this at the end of every speech. It was inspirational, and the writer said, when we heard that speech, we would head for the bus to get a good seat near Bobby, and Freckles would head for the bus too when he heard it. And here is Freckles beating Bobby, and the writer's back to the bus. So Bobby was almost never alone when I saw him. I never spoke to him. He never spoke to me. There was no reason to. I think this guy was his speechwriter. I'm not sure, but he was always with somebody asking him this or telling him this or asking for a picture. And one day we were on the plane to leave a small airport in Nebraska. And I looked out the window and saw Bobby without anybody with him but Freckles. And so I asked the Secret Service if I could make a picture. And they said, well, why don't you just go halfway down the steps and shoot and don't bother him, which I did. So this was the last frame I made of Bobby. And the next week he went on to California, where he was killed, and Bill Epridge got the shot of Bobby in the hotel on the floor in the kitchen. It was a great privilege to be on the campaign even for 7 days. The next campaign I went on, I figured out, get close to the candidate, get as close as you can. He looks like, don't be this close. I want to be where you are, get out of my way. But actually I liked photographing Nixon because he seemed to really like campaigning. I know that he's had some bad things that he's done, and he's had some great things that he's done, but he was a good campaigner to shoot. He seemed to enjoy this more than anything else. He had a great smile. But there were so many pictures you could make of a smile. So I began watching Pat, how she pushed people forward. Here's Tricia and Julie, and Richard, of course. And she always seemed to be just backing up him, never in the limelight. And of course that was her job, but it was interesting to see her doing these things. I wonder why this is tilted. Anyway, she was always there to back up Dick, and they seemed to be close but not want to touch. So I don't know what I'm reading into that picture, but the last picture I made was in a rainy shopping center in New Jersey, and I think it's the best picture I got of Pat and Dick together. So I was happy with that, even though it's grainy and not quite sharp. George Wallace was also running in 1968. He was running on the segregation ticket and the white supremacy ticket. And as such, he had a lot of people upset. So all of the people in the foreground are bodyguards or Secret Service or policemen or hired help. But anyway, this is on State Street in Chicago. And you can count the bodyguard, or whatever you want to call them, down here to keep people away from Wallace. He really did stake out his base as the blue-collar workers of America against the intellectuals, and he would refer to us as the time life people and encourage people to throw chairs down into the section where we were sitting in auditoriums. Here is a man on State Street who made his thoughts about Wallace very clear and then backed it up with the expression on his face. When the convention came to Chicago, I had a very dull assignment. I was to be on the podium, be on a scaffolding in front of the podium down at the stockyards in the convention center. And I was just to photograph that podium. Whenever a speaker came up, I took pictures. Whenever Hubert Humphrey accepted the nomination, whenever he did, I was to shoot that. So it was boring, and I had another lens that I would sometimes shoot down in the crowd. And I like this picture because I always liked Julian Bond right here from Georgia. But there wasn't a lot that I got in that auditorium that was very good. This picture, I looked down one day and Shirley MacLaine and Rosie Greer, the NFL star, was sitting right at the base of the scaffolding that I was on. Before the convention actually started, I went out into the park to shoot some things. And here's Abby Hoffman talking to, we think, John Freund, and I'm not sure who these other guys are. But Abby has his office in his hip pocket, and he knew exactly that he was going to disrupt things. The other fellow that I photographed during that were multiple press conferences with Mayor Daley, and they were almost contact sports. People were going over the top of each other, stick microphones in his face, and he was very embattled, as I'm sure was written in all the newspapers at the time. I never really disliked Daley. I think he was under a lot of pressure and made some bad decisions, but Chicago survived the riots, and Daley survived that too and went on. In 1975, I was shooting for People magazine, and we had an interview with Daley. He had a hospital visit with a really serious problem with an artery in his neck, and came back from that, and he seemed to be a nicer guy. I mean, he seemed to be different anyway, but it's kind of a line in winter shot. For some reason, I do not understand to this day, I took a 4x5 camera into the office to photograph him. And, you know, for those of you who don't know, it's as big as a toaster. You have to put it on a tripod. You have to get under a black cloth. You have to open the lens, put a slide, I'll do all these things. So I had used it before, and sometimes it would calm people down. It would give them a chance to kind of get into the flow of being in the picture rather than I'm grabbing a picture with a small camera. But I was so flustered being with Daley that I could not get the camera to focus. I knew what to do. Luckily, I had my trusty Leica, and so I grabbed this shot and the previous shot before we left. So I've always liked this shot the best, but when I was looking at these shots, I kind of like this shot the best. So if you vote, you can vote for the first shot or the second shot, or not vote at all. On March 17th, I made this picture of Daley going to vote. It's his neighborhood in Bridgeport, and that's his wife, Eleanor, who is also known as Sis. And the guys are helping him get across the street in a snowstorm. But I mean, he lived in this neighborhood all the time he was mayor, and he could walk over to the poll conveniently located for him to vote. But this is my absolute favorite picture of Mayor Daley. The director of photography would call and say, Michael, you're shooting a lot of politicians and doctors and teachers in Chicago. Why don't you go out to LA and shoot an actress? And so I said, okay, I will. You recognize this person as one of the most beautiful women in the world at the time. It was Candice Bergen. And she was definitely a beautiful actress and lived the life of a Hollywood star with this big poster of Victor Mature as Samson. And of course, her dog, she loved her dog. This was on the John Barrymore estate, and Candy lived in the aviary. So can you imagine this place full of birds and butterflies and everything? But anyway, this was her living room, and she lived up I've forgotten the canyon where she lived, but she would go out and cut flowers for a party or ride her horse. And I think she liked to ride her horse every day. And when I was there, she couldn't, and that kind of bothered her a little, but we got around that. So one day, her friends and the writer and Candy and I were in her bedroom, and we were making joke photos. And I'd never seen a bedroom that had a rainbow painted in it. And so I thought it was interesting, and Candy was in a good mood. This is how life ran those pictures. My horse picture was better than the one they chose. Here she is with the rainbow. Here she is. But is this a little bit cheesy? I'm sorry, life. A few assorted bits of Candy. And they didn't let me go to Cannes with her to shoot her at the film festival. But anyway, this is the day that we were going to make a cover. And I never, ever promised anybody a cover. And I don't know if the magazine did, but I think they had to, because I think maybe Candy needed a boost in her career. And they said, we'll give you a cover if you'll put up with Michael for a few days. So I had to to myself for a few hours, and I picked this place on her patio because I liked the light. The natural light, lots of it, and a background that wasn't too distracting, because I knew I could soften the background with a long lens. Candy had her makeup done just right. I had the right lens. I had it in focus. We were just working on her expressions till she got a good expression, and I got a cover. Candy got a cover. I really think this would have been a better cover, but you know, they didn't consult me about that. So anyway, I was happy to have a cover and that extra $1,000. Joke photos. To relieve the incredible tension of being on these assignments, I would make joke photos. So one day I was out at MGM and they were selling off their costumes. Huge warehouses, hangar-like warehouses of costumes. I mean, these were all the buckskins from How the West Was Won, or these were the tuxedos from Fred Astaire's movies. And I found the lion suit from The Wizard of Oz. So I snuck it out, put it on. Who knows, took this picture of me standing in front of this wagon. But for about 30 seconds, I said, you know, you should just roll this thing up and put it in your camera bag. But of course, that would have been stealing, and somebody would not have paid over $1.5 million for it last year or the year before. But it wasn't always celebrities and movie stars and politicians. One summer, a writer and I, Sean Callahan, were assigned to be in a mobile bureau, like Charles Kuralt, going around America just shooting real people. And so we found ourselves at the Apple River between Wisconsin and Minnesota. And a Saturday float, everybody in the county came out and floated down the river. And so we shot this and sent it in. They never used it because really the pictures look like family snapshots. Stop sending me texts because I'm looking at them. Anyway, they didn't use these pictures, but in the fall, Life had been doing a special issue on Americans at leisure, Americans having a great time in the summertime. And one of the editors called me and said, Michael, you remember those pictures you made on the Apple River? And I said, yeah, I want to use one. And they said, well, we don't have a cover and we don't like your pictures, but would you go back and try to shoot it again? So I did. I went back, I think it was late August, early September. And also she shot a lot of the same pictures, but later in the day when the light got softer, I found this group of friends who had discovered they could go on a very short float and go through the rapids, have a lot of fun splashing, get out, go back up and go through the rapids over and over. And so I just kind of set up there with my favorite 400 millimeter and focused in on this great group of friends coming down through there. I don't know what was making them laugh. I was 50 yards away. It could have been the water, it could have been the beer, but as they came through every time, it just got more and more fun for them. And of course, I was zeroed in. All I had to do was press the trigger. I'm sure I had a motor drive, and they actually raised the quality of the picture with that wonderful caption, "The Endless Weekend." You know, going back through this, I was just looking at this little girl back here, and she's doing everything she can. She's carrying her part back there in the back. She's laughing. She looks good, and she's probably laughing here, but they put the logo right over her face. So I don't know if she noticed or cared or ever saw the pictures. One time they called and said, Michael, it's time for you to come to New York and do Dick Cavett. Dick was the reigning late night talk show host, and they thought that we would get along together, and we did actually. I would shoot these things in black and white, and then we would try for the cover in color. And I'm sure they promised Dick a cover, or he wouldn't have let me come and be there all week bothering him. I was, in his dressing room when he was shaving. I was there as he's writing and eating a banana, and then here he is with Norman Mailer on the show, and he and Norman Mailer had some back and forth that everybody knows about. But I went out to Montauk to shoot the cover, turned the camera to a vertical, you're liable to get a cover. So we thought it would be very witty if he had his dogs in the picture, which of course it isn't. It's not even close. But while he was there, the fact that he was barefooted, I got back and got a long shot of that. And so here he appears to be interviewing Louis. I remember the dog's name, even though I can't remember my zip code now. But he's interviewing Louis, and they actually ran that picture, and I think it's a pretty good shot. It looks like Leo's answering back. But anyway, this is Montauk, where Dick and his wife Carrie and I had a house, and they were totally relaxed with me being there, and totally relaxed around each other. And that's what happens when people are relaxed. You get shots like that. So I knew that I hadn't had a cover, but one weekend, I think it was a Saturday. We get Dick with a kerchief, and he's done his hair, and we're in his kitchen where we had like a studio light on it, but it's really his kitchen window, and we got a cover out of that too. So good for Dick. He was absolutely great to be around. When I wasn't photographing celebrities, I was photographing my family. Dick Pollard had said to me the first year, he said, "Michael, listen, when you're not on assignment, don't go downtown and have lunch with Gerald every day. You stay home and be with your family, because when it's Thanksgiving week and it's Tuesday and I call you and say, I want you to go on assignment, I want you to go on assignment. So spend time with your family when you're not on assignment." And I did. And I had 3 daughters, and I loved photographing them all. Would you know it that my absolute favorite picture of Beth is on Polaroid. We just use Polaroid to check exposures for strobes. And, but I always did like peeling them, opening the camera and peeling them off that paper roll. And it's my favorite picture. And she told me recently it was her favorite picture too. She's showing me all her fabulous artwork here. Actually, I think she just colored those. I don't think she really drew those Disney characters, but this is not going to be about a family album, but the girls came to me one time and they said, "You should see Caitlin." Our 3rd daughter was born in '69. And I remember it was right after I got back from John Glenn going on the moon. I was shooting his mother's house in Ohio, and we induced labor so that I'd be home when Caitlin came. So she was born right after John Glenn stepped on the moon. Anyway, the girls came to me one day and said, "You should see Caitlin. She loves putting her toes in her mouth." So I put her on a piece of black felt and bounced a light into an umbrella. And I said, "Okay, talk to her." So she seemed happy, and her sisters started talking to her and distracting her from looking at the camera. And the more they talked, the happier Caitlin got, until, wow, she put her toes in her mouth. So along with that thing of Dick Pollard telling me to shoot the girls, I had shot Caitlin heavily for 2 years. And about 6 months before it was up, I realized something that parents do realize, that at about 2 years, you can tell what your child's personality is going to be. So I printed up all the pictures on 11x14, sent these pictures to New York, and said, "Look, I know it's my daughter, I know it's nepotism, but here's my essay on the first 2 years." And the editor, Phil Kuhnhart, looked at me, turned redder than he usually was. And he said, "Michael, I don't care if it's your daughter, it's the best thing you've ever shot, but we can't use it." I said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, we just paid 2 child psychologists $10,000 to write an essay called The First 2 Years, and we're going to run with that." So I didn't really care, because I thought it would have already been embarrassing to Caitlin to have 10 pages of pictures in Life magazine. But a year later, Ron Bailey, who was picture editor, called me and he said, "Hey, Michael, do you remember those pictures you sent out of Caitlin?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you still have them?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Would you send me some? We're doing an issue on population explosion, and we don't have a cover." So Caitlin's toes and Caitlin's smile ended up on the cover after all. So end of the family album, almost. It's funny how people would come back into my presence with a camera. In 1972, Nixon had been reelected by a landslide, and I was assigned to go to, was it 72 or 70? This was 74. I'm sorry. He was reelected, right? 68, 72. Anyway, I can't do the math in front of all of you. I was at the Grand Ole Opry when they left the Ryman Auditorium and went to Opryland. And there was Richard Nixon at Opryland. I mean, if there was somebody you didn't expect to see at a country music thing, it was Richard Nixon. But he actually sat down and played the piano on stage at the Grand Ole Opry, which I thought was kind of terrific. It was May 72, that's when that was. So much for Richard playing the piano at the Grand Ole Opry. Speaking of the Grand Ole Opry, one of my favorite assignments was country music. And I didn't know a lot about country music, but I wanted to photograph the people who didn't get paid for it, that would just play it because it was part of their family, or part of their tradition, or part of their history. And Fred Price here from Mountain City, Tennessee is one of those guys. I called the Library of Congress and said, look, I'm doing this story. Who should I photograph? And they said, well, we could tell you about thousands of people, but call Bill Ivey at the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville, and he'll tell you who you really should photograph. And he sent me to Fred. And Fred was the real deal, you know. I mean, talk about rosin on the bow. Fred really believed in rosin on the bow. But he's got that farmer tan, so he was an outdoor guy who loved to play. Here he is in his living room. Fred had a neighbor, Clint Howard, and again, how I can remember Clint's name, I don't know, but they were playing out in the backyard one day, and their sons were showing off by fingering each other's instruments, which I cannot finger a single instrument, much less somebody else's, but it's just showing off. But it's also how incredibly skilled these musicians are. They maybe cannot read a note or never looked at a note on a page, but they can play. I broke my rule. I had to go to the Grand Ole Opry, and here is a lady, and it looks like a homemade dress, and she's coming down with the age-old tradition at the Opry that anybody could come down and make a picture of anybody. So the Opry stops when the picture's made, just for a second. What I really liked finding with situations like this, where the guys that closed the service station for the night, and they were just having their little fun session for themselves, no audience. I just happened to walk up. Again, color film was not really clean and crisp under these lighting, this fluorescent lighting, but so I switched to black and white and posed the picture. But you know, it's a good posed picture because you see these faces so clearly, and in black and white, you're not looking at the bad lighting or the bad color, and you're seeing these guys who genuinely like playing together and being together. I also could not resist going and calling Bill Monroe and getting an audience with Bill Monroe. And again, black and white was the film to use for him. This is on his horse farm in Kentucky. Bill Monroe, of course, didn't invent bluegrass music, but he's kind of the father of bluegrass music in this country. But the heart and soul of my story were people like Roscoe Parrish in the center and his neighbors playing in their backyard. And I'm sure I asked him, I asked Roscoe if I could do it, and so he asked his neighbors over. But I mean, this guy was with the farmer tan again, and he's got on his best overalls. I think there's Roscoe in his New Pointer jeans, which are made up in Johnson City, Tennessee to this day. And he was just so beautiful and so wonderful and kind that I said, can I just photograph you tomorrow? I want to photograph you in your barn. So he met me the next day, and I made this picture. And I'll tell you, I could see that big red logo go right up here. And to put this man on the cover with his homemade banjo and that face, I did get 10 pages, and they laid it out for a cover, but the managing editor came back, and Ralph hated country music, and he said, get that off the cover and put another one on. I really didn't care if they ran my pictures or not, because they gave me the fun of making them. They gave me the chance to make them, but this cover I really wanted to get, so didn't get it. You never knew what you're going to do next, and so 1969, Leo DeRocher was almost taking the Cubs to a pennant, and they knew I was not a sports photographer, but they said, you can go to St. Louis and just photograph headshots of Leo. So I did. So I'm in Leo, and I had a borrowed 500 millimeter lens from Sean Callahan, and a mirror lens. It was huge, big lens, but I was about 25 or 30 feet away from Leo doing these shots. And every time I'd shoot him, he'd see me, he would turn away, and then I would circle around the circle until I could see him again. And it was starting to annoy him. So he threw a bat at me. And I think that's Lou Bedreau, who was the great shortstop for the Indians later. But anyway, I actually caught the bat in my left hand, shot the picture with the Canon, with a Nikon that didn't have the long lens on it. Shot the picture, caught the bat, took it over, and I said, Mr. DeRocher, I think this is your bat. And he said, oh, you got to be careful. We got to be careful here. But anyway, I was not a sports photographer. Back to shooting black and white and back to shooting in Chicago. I had the privilege of traveling around with Jesse Jackson. John Peckinpah and I traveled around with Jesse for a while, and it was such a privilege to be down at Operation Push. It was partly gospel, partly jazz, and of course Jesse was really a preacher, who of course was also a politician and also a leader, I thought. Very, very much fun to be around. You were always a little on edge around Jesse, but he was still fun to be around. And being from life, you could go with people anywhere. And I found this picture that I had never really looked at, but the scene is Jesse is called to school. His son has done something wrong, and the teacher is telling him. So here's the son. He knows he's busted. Jesse is very disappointed. He's thinking of, what can I do? And she's thinking, let's see, what are you going to do about this? And he's thinking, I'm glad it's not me. I'm with him. Let me get a drink. I'm starting to squeak. As always with life, you never knew what they were going to ask you to do next. But I don't think I ever turned down an assignment, and I think I always look forward to going out and trying whatever they sent me to do. And this was to photograph the medicine men of the Navajo tribe. This is Tom Wilson. The medicine men were given the status that we give judges in our culture, and they had given up setting broken legs and treating pneumonia or appendicitis and let the white men do that. But they treated their patients as psychiatrists, and it was just a privilege to be with them. But here again, Life magazine said, well, while you're out there, we're doing a story on Indian jewelry, and you can shoot them both. So I would shoot the medicine men for a few days, and then I would meet Jill St. John, who loved Indian jewelry and had quite a collection. And Jill, of course, was one of the Bond girls, but she knew something about Indian jewelry, and she would go straight to the artisans and buy their jewelry, take it back to LA and sell it for 8 times what it was worth, and then split with them. She was very fair. She had done this for a long time or some time, and they trusted her and she trusted them. It's a lot of fun actually to go with her to meet the artisans. Here's medicine man Billy Sam with his take on Indian jewelry. And he was one of my absolute favorite guys to photograph on that story. And here he is, a conference about psychiatry and medicine men, and you can see what Billy Sam thinks of that, although he did put his Indian jewelry on, his best Indian jewelry on, in addition to his string through his ear. But a privilege to be out there and photograph a family that did jewelry. And then you see this slide, and I don't know that I ever saw the little boy up there when I was doing it, but for me, that makes the picture. Even though I love the faces, I love the jewelry, I love the light, the little boy makes the picture for me. Back to Chicago, and here's Eppie Lederer, also known as Ann Landers. And she was one of the great people I ever photographed. She was, here she is doing her exercises in her really wonderful apartment on Lakeshore Drive. And I was in Chicago, she was in Chicago, so I would just see her for a few hours one day and a few hours another day. We were in her limo one day riding somewhere, and she had all these letters And I said, you take those everywhere? And she said, oh yes, I read every letter every reader sends me. And I said, really? She said, I take them to meetings. If I'm at the dentist, I have to wait. I read letters. I even read letters in bed. And I said, would you let me shoot a picture of you reading letters? And she said, sure, you can shoot a picture of me in bed. So this is a setup shot. And I'm not even sure if we used it or not, but I just like the fact that she wanted to do this shot of her reading letters in bed. And I believe she did read letters in bed. Great hair, great person, great fun to shoot her. And again, this was for People magazine. And then I was down in the Pedernales River photographing Ladybird. And every time I see those wonderful wildflowers on the highway, I think Ladybird for her American Beautification program. Tried to get a cover of Jimmy Carter and Roseland and didn't. This was my cover attempt. You can kind of see why that's not a cover, but you know, we started using plain backgrounds, and I thought it was nice to have their artwork in their living room behind it. But the story was about Roseland, and so I concentrated on her. And if the pictures aren't good, always get a. This is my always get an animal in the picture if the picture's not interesting enough. When I arrived in Plains, I did have an assistant with me. We took lights in just for that one shot, and so I go in to meet Jimmy, and I go in to meet Roseland, and the Secret Service takes me in. I come back out to help my assistant carry in the cases, and Jimmy's out there helping my assistant carry in the cases. It was really a privilege to be with them for a few days. You may or may not recognize this man, James Michener, but you probably have read his books or read some of his books. He had moved to Austin, Texas because he was doing a book called Texas. And I was down to spend a day or two with him and trying to get a picture that related to Texas, or that, you know, visually had Michener in Texas. So this was the best picture I got that week. I had tried everything. I met him in the stacks at the University of Texas, I guess. And I said, what's more Texan than a pickup truck with a rifle in the rear window? And but you can't tell it's really Michener, but it was fun to shoot the picture. And we went to the Alamo, which was closed, and that was ugly light anyway. So I kept trying. Okay, barbed wire and an abandoned farm. That's Texas. That's barbed wire. No, I was not getting the picture I want. But as luck would have it, we go to an armadillo farm. And he picks up an armadillo. And I knew I had the picture that I wanted. They ran it in the magazine, but also Time Life liked it enough that they ran a full-page picture in the New York Times. And this is the Chicago Tribune because that was the one that I got, and I tore it out. But anyway, that's the armadillo's full-page ad as promised in the New York Times. I don't know how we're doing for time, Wendy, but if we've got time, I'll do this story about Alex Haley, and that'll be it. Also for people, Alex had
we're good on time.
We're good on time? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Alex had written the best-selling book Roots, and it became the best-selling miniseries on ABC. But he had promised, before his fame really soared, he had promised to go back to high schools in the South and talk to high school students about the importance of recording your family history. And so he kept to that. And so we flew around on prop plane. Linda Witt and I flew around. She was a bureau chief for People, flew around on planes and went to small towns. This is somewhere in South Carolina. I love the Scouts and the key to the city, or the plaque, or, it looks like an honorary. He's made him an honorary deputy sheriff or something. Anyway, we followed Alex, trying to get him off to himself. And I was certainly thinking cover, but had not been able to make one. And I would ask Alex, I never said, could we go shoot a cover shot? I said, let's go do some portraits. And so he would give me a time alone without anybody else taking his picture. And we kept doing this periodically through the shoot, but never did get it. Anyway, we ended up at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And the next day, Linda and I and Alex and his friend were having breakfast and saying goodbye. And we said, okay, we're going back to Chicago. And where are you going? And he said, well, I'm going to Africa. And we said, oh, really? what for? And he said, well, ABC's taking me back over there to go to the village I wrote about, the village my ancestors came from, Juvaray, up the Gambia River. And Linda, who was the bureau chief and never missed a beat, said, are any other still photographers going with you, Alex? And he said, no. She said, just a minute. She left and we had a cup of coffee. She came back. She had called Hal Wingo and said, we have exclusive rights to photograph Alex as he goes back home to Juvaray. So a few days later, we found ourselves in Africa with Alex Haley and all these wonderful people. The crowds were still big, but very, very different. And I couldn't wait to photograph some of these faces of these people. The crowd was enthusiastic. I think they had done a good job of getting people revved up. And I love this guy in the red mask. I never did see him take it off, but I wish I had done some pictures of him holding the mask. So sometimes I would take a family member along, and because I was gone so much, my middle daughter, Mary Michael, went along on this trip. And, you know, she didn't talk about the trip for months after she got back, and then she couldn't stop talking about it. But I think she enjoyed these kinds of moments. And I doubt if these children had ever seen a white person their size before. Linda had gotten Mary an assignment from Children's Express to interview Alex, and he'd say, Mary, don't you want to interview me? And she'd say, well, maybe tomorrow or maybe this afternoon. Finally, we would go back and forth from Dakar, where we were staying, up to Juvaray on the presidential yacht. And he pinned her down and said, okay, this is it. And she finally interviewed him. This is where ABC had kind of set this up as kind of a council meeting. And again, you can see these faces, this guy that I went for. So this was their time. Monita Sleet, I believe, was with either Jet magazine, or I'm not sure what he was with. But anyway, he was photographing it, set this up. And I was just taking my time, since this was something I didn't have to really pay attention to. I did photograph the faces around. I would have given anything to have spent 5 minutes talking to this guy, but I'm sure we wouldn't have understood each other. This face, just such, maybe she and I could have talked in English, but anyway, I didn't have a chance. And so this face, really fun. But so back to Alex, I was still needing that cover and not getting it. And I can't tell you how much your stomach starts to turn cold, and you try pictures and it's not working, and your sphincters clench and you don't know what to do next. And so we got to think it up. Monita set this up. We got them set up in a place like this, and I'm thinking, it's still not a cover. This is looking more like a cover, but it's still not like a cover. And somehow we shifted, our people shifted, and I said, get it in focus and get an expression, and it was a cover. So thank you, Monita, for that cover. That's all I have to say. It's from I was in a bygone era back then. Black and white film. I did a lot of film myself. You would make the contacts, you would pick the contacts, you would X the frames out. Actually, this is me at that time. This is the Nixon campaign. This is take my word for it, Bobby Kennedy. And this was my favorite camera of all time.
But this was, and
what?
I'm sorry,
what, Wendy? It's a time warp, Wendy. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were finished.
Well, this is the last finish. This is the last picture.
Oh.
I'm talking about my camera. This was a camera that was so simple, no battery, no autofocus, no auto exposure. And yet it was just dead on when you used it. It came out of the factory in 1964, painted black. I had worn the paint off down to the brass. I still have that lens. I still have that camera. I don't use it much because it takes film, but it's my all-time favorite camera. I called it my American Express camera. I never left home without it for 30 years. So that is the end, Wendy.
Okay.
That's all I have to say.
Pardon me for interrupting you before.
No. I did say I was finished. I'm sorry.
I did not mean to cut you off
Okay.
by any sense.
How long did that take, Wendy? How long? How were we?
Of about 55 minutes, something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought
It
it
was
would go
perfect.
over when I put Michener in. Yeah.
No, this is fine. Okay, I have a few questions. Felicia has a great question. Which photograph evoked the most personal fear in you to prepare for and take?
I don't know. You know, when I should have been afraid in almost all of these situations. You're always afraid of not getting it because you were on assignment and you had to get what they expected you or what they wanted you or something better than what they wanted. So you were always fearful of not getting the right shot. But can I have a week to think about that and get back to it? I don't know. When I was shooting, it was just like I was in a different zone. Sometimes I wouldn't hear people. And I remember photographing the president of Chile, and I'm taken into his room after 10 days of waiting. And I don't think I was anxious about doing it. But so I don't know. I don't have a ready answer for that. But it's, as they say, when you don't have an answer, that's a very good question.
Okay. All right, hang on one second. Burton says Vince Lloyd was with DeRocher.
Vince Lloyd instead of Boudreaux. Wow. Well,
Jody would like to know, did you ever photograph any rock stars?
You know, only once. I went to the first Farm Aid concert at the University of Illinois, and I was to make a cover of that. And so we assembled everybody we could. And so John Mellencamp was the co-host of that with Willie Nelson. And so I had gone to John's farm in Indiana to photograph him. And then when we did the picture there, I had Tom Petty was in the picture along with Willie Nelson and Loretta Lynn and Roger Miller and all. So that's no, I did not go off on a tour. I did not go photograph the Stones and I never photographed Janis Joplin. I wish I could have gotten this camera and been 5 feet away from Janis Joplin. But anyway, no, I didn't, sadly.
Okay. Michelle would like to know, what do you think of digital cameras? Which medium do you use now?
Well, I think they're great. I think they're heavy. And it's a wonderful way of making images. And the Leica is a wonderful way of making images. And the Nikons that I used back then with long lenses were great. And the Canons I used for 30 years, autofocus, auto exposure Canons are great. And I can't say that I really prefer one over the other. It's just that I like making images, and they're both really good instruments to make images. I use digital cameras now more because I don't have a darkroom. And so I always had a darkroom until about 6 or 7 years ago. And then I had to rethink all of the film, all of the negatives, all of the cameras in the safe that use film. But
Michael, your voice is fading
cameras.
just a bit.
I love digital cameras. How's that?
Okay. Lots of compliments. I'll share those with you later.
Oh, share them now. No, I'm
okay.
just kidding. I'm just kidding. Really, I'm kidding.
Okay, let's see.
Those are good questions, probably.
Hang on one second. What was the camera and lens? But this person's not being specific about what. So I'm not sure how you would answer that. Deborah would like to know, do you still do photography for any magazines?
They're kind of few and far between. The last magazine I worked for was a year ago. It's American Craft, which is a beautiful magazine about artists and craftsmen. And I went over to Aramon in Tennessee and photographed. And I've been to Penland, which is close by. It's a wonderful arts school for American craft. But the last real magazine, I mean, I don't know what you consider a real magazine, but I haven't had any assignments from People. And I can't think of any others that I can't think of one I'd really like to work for, but actually, I know I would love to work for the New York Times Sunday Magazine. I think some of the best photography in the country is done by their list of photographers. And they really do a good job of presenting the pictures, and it's the best photojournalism going. I enjoy the pictures in Time Magazine that I see, so.
Cynthia would like to know, what's the make and model of your favorite camera?
Leica M3 film camera. I have digital Leicas now that will take the same lenses from the 60s because they fit on, but they still aren't autofocus. So you've got to focus the lens manually. Leica does make a digital camera that's not full frame that is autofocus, and I have one of those, and I do use it often because the focus is very good and very quick. And one thing that happens with these cameras, you're looking through these two little windows focusing, and then you have to do that every shot if you want to see the eyelashes sharp.
Okay. Sue would like to know, do you use the iPhone Pro for taking pictures? And have you ever used it? What do you think about it?
What is it? iPhone Pro?
It's the newest camera included with the latest version of iPhone. I think iPhone 10 maybe.
Okay. I think there's 11 out now, but I don't have an 11. I have a 10, and I like using it. I mean, I like the pictures it makes, except they're too perfect. And so I like for there to be a little light and dark places. And I mean, they smooth it out. The algorithms just make everything look perfect. But I don't like the act of using an iPhone, of pressing that button. I shake the phone too much. I can't hold it steady. But I don't know. I'm certainly not up on the latest iPhone technology.
Okay.
But it's a great way to make pictures.
Gilbert would like to know, how often did you ever have film confiscated?
Never.
Okay.
Well, we didn't show the pictures, but I was once in Mexico shooting on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, and we were doing about Salvadoran refugees coming in, and people were coming across the river on inner tubes, and I was photographing a federale guy and a priest that I was doing the story on, and I really thought he was going to turn around and say, "Give me your film," but he didn't. So thank goodness I never had any actually confiscated.
Yeah, that is good.
Yes.
Okay, let's see. What's your opinion of selfies? Rita asks. Would you ever take one, and has anyone ever taken one with you in it?
You know, I'm not sure that selfie, that picture of me wearing Bert Lahr's line suit wasn't a selfie. I could have run around and gotten into it, but I'm tired of people always looking the same in selfies. And I'm really tired of people sticking their tongues out as if that's clever in a selfie. But I love taking selfies, actually, and I'm so weird looking now that I try to turn them to black and white and make them more weird. I think it's fun. And really, when I was traveling around, every once in a while, I would take a selfie. You had to put your camera on a tripod, put it on self-timer, and run around, or have somebody else do it. And if you did, but none were really very good. But yeah, I think selfies are fun. And whenever I'm with my daughter Elizabeth, she always makes a selfie of us together. It's payback, I guess, for all the times I shot her.
Jody would like to know, would you get paid if you didn't deliver a cover shot or something that they wanted? The magazine sent you out on an assignment, you brought it back, and they didn't like them for whatever reason.
I'm going to have nightmares just thinking about that one. But, you know, there was a lot of pressure to deliver. And one thing, the life gave gave me story. They knew I was a small town person. They gave me stories they thought I would succeed with. And so I did succeed. And if I hadn't gotten that cover of Cabot, they would have sent me back and said, why don't you go back and shoot some more? Why don't you go back and shoot another cover, Dick? And this time, why don't you take some strobes? But I never had I've had failures where I didn't get the assignment done, but you always got paid. You got paid for your time. You're paid for your time, and they could use as many pictures as they want. We didn't get paid by the picture, but sometimes I wish we had by the frame. But yeah, that would be a nightmare to have one chance to shoot a cover of the President of the United States and miss it. That would be bad. And I guess I would be in such depression, I wouldn't even know if I got paid or not.
Okay. Kim would like to know, did you ever work with Rowan or David Stach, art directors?
Oh, well, Rowan was at Life, I think, wasn't he? Yeah. Wasn't he a big Life editor? I didn't work directly with a lot of the editors there. I worked with the director of photography, Dick Pollard, and Ron Bailey. I worked with writers and reporters and bureau chiefs, but I didn't go. Photographers weren't really welcome to go sit in the editing rooms because we would have just been chattering away and be a big distraction. I was only once in an editing room when they were looking at the Dick Cabot cover, and they said, "Don't say anything." But Roy Rowan is a very familiar name to me, but I don't remember specifically working with him.
Okay, you were not allowed to express any point of view about edits for your photography?
No, you just when they were right down into the editing room picking the stories for that week, it would be the managing editor, the editor-in-chief, or the managing editor, and the top editors of the sections you were talking about, music or science or whatever, and they just had to get the job done. But no, I could call Peggy Sargent and say, that thing I shot of Paul Newman, look for those good pictures of Paul when I got the red, white, and blue thing behind him. She would love that. Peggy Sargent looked at all your film, and God bless her, she once said to me, Michael, you don't have to press the button every time you look through the camera. But you could freely put notes in on roll number 17, or you'd shoot something and say, where I shot the clock, look for some good pictures after that. Yeah, they welcomed our views, but not in detail. You just try to let them do their job.
And did you just provide the rolls of film that they developed, or did you develop the film and then present it?
Well, first of all, they paid for everything. So when I bought film, it was all, Life sent you film, actually. They would send you cases. They would send you 600 rolls of Kodachrome at a time. But when I would shoot black and white Trix film, I would sometimes say, I'd like to develop this in my darkroom, make contacts and prints. And they'd say, okay, but give us all the film and all the contacts. So if we don't like the pictures that you picked to print, we can see something else. And so I think Dick Pollard actually liked it, that I was that interested to do it. The really, really fabulous photographer that really shot wonderful black and white was a great printer. And John just died, and so he was allowed to print in the Life darkroom, but none of the other of us. I went in once, but I didn't print there. But I would print stories at home, send them the contacts, and I'd mark the contacts, and they could see the prints. But it was a privilege to be able to look at your film and send in your selects, but you had to send in everything.
Okay, how do you store your negatives? Cynthia asks.
I just stored them in glassine envelopes and in archival boxes, actually. And, it's so much. I mean, I look at 40 years of film, and 2 boxes that I can put on one table. And I think of the hard drives that it takes just to shoot the annual reports that I shot in the 80s and 90s. Storage of negatives is so efficient. I'm in the process of throwing out a lot of negatives and a lot of contacts now. So, but it's just, you know, in a very small file cabinet, you can put all your film in negatives. So.
Sue comments and asks, you appear to have the actual photos in your possession. I wonder if there are copies in archives, or if you have made plans for preservation, or maybe the photos belong to the publications who commissioned you.
There's a thing of copyright where if you, I can't turn this off now. Can I turn off life as it was?
Sure.
Okay. Now the screen just went funny for some reason. This is better.
Let's bring you back.
The copyright law says if you created the pictures, you own it, unless you specifically sign them away. When I freelanced for Life, they sent me my pictures back. When I was on staff for Life, they kept some of the pictures. They would keep any of the pictures that they published. They would keep the cover picture or the black and white that they ran. But usually I would get the negatives back or the contacts. And just recently, I mean, 40 years later, I'm looking and thinking, gee, they never sent me back the country music. I've got the contact sheets, but not the negatives, or I've got the negatives, but not the contact. So I was a little lax in asking for what was rightfully mine, but really most of what a photographer does belongs to him unless he specifically signs a contract to give it away. Or unless you work for Getty and then they own everything.
So if someone wanted a copy of a photograph that they saw today, should they just contact you?
Yeah, if they're willing to pay a lot of money. No, actually, one of the pleasures of my young life is giving pictures away. And so it would depend on which picture, whether I had it, whether it's already scanned. You know, there's pictures of Daly and the people out in the Abbey, out in the park. I don't have the negatives. I just took pictures of the contact sheets. Literally, you know, took a picture of the contact sheet and it's good enough for the screen. It probably wouldn't make a great print, but it would make up to an 8x10. But in a dark room, it was no problem. You just go back in, pull out the negative, put it in the larger. Here, I have to go and find it, which is something of a chore sometimes. And depends on if it's color, black and white. No, I can print color now, but it just depends.
Okay. Who was the nicest person you ever had to shoot photos of?
Impossible to say. I liked most of the people. It was rare that I went away from somebody and not liking them. And that was one of the best things about my job was being in contact with people as I was photographing them. And I would come away with this just great feeling about having made contact with somebody I would never have made contact if I hadn't been on assignment. But
do you think that is because you were both working, whoever you were photographing, and that they needed something just as much as you needed something from them?
Oh, sure. That was cooperation. I mean, I couldn't have called Candy Bergen and said, "Oh, I'm a young photographer from Chicago. I just happen to be out here. Can I come up and shoot some headshots?" You know, it was always a trade. And, you know, I realized I was representing a media outlet that they needed or wanted. And probably there had been some transactional talks between an agent and the people at Life. I mean, Life would call and say, you know, Candy's really in a lot of movies. We'd love to do a story on him. And at that point, the agent would say, well, it'd be great for Candy too. Can you give us a cover? And they'd say, sure. But it was a transaction. And I, not for a minute, had an idea that these people were going to be my friends, or that Paul Newman was going to call me and say, hey, Michael, come out and spend the weekend with me and Joan. You know, it was always a deal. As I said, I never spoke to Bobby Kennedy, and he never spoke to me. And Bill Epridge, who had made that incredible shot of him on the floor in the kitchen, said he refused to have dinner with the Kennedys or the campaign people because he wanted to maintain a distance that would let him do his job when the time came. And that's exactly what he did.
Okay.
But no, I can't say who I like photographing the best. I loved a lot of people. I love photographing Augie Papsdown. Oh, you can't see the picture anymore, but Augie Papsdown there was a really sweet guy to photograph.
The country music, the man with the violin, the homemade violin.
Would he be the most favorite?
No, I'm asking who that person you just mentioned.
Oh, I just mentioned Augie Paps, who was the Pabst Brewery
Oh, I see. Okay.
heir, and we did him for people. And Augie was, you know, a multi-millionaire, and just so much fun to be around, so easy to be around. And of course, I was around him for 5 or 6 hours, you know, and it was always in and out. So
Ada would like to know, who do you regret not photographing?
Oh my goodness. Well, I said Janis Joplin, but
Or the person you wanted to shoot but didn't get a chance to?
I just can't answer that. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think there was one, just like you don't have one favorite photograph of all these, you don't have one favorite assignment or one big regret of one person, but it's a good question. I just can't answer it.
Okay. What inspired you to become a photographer?
I don't know. Do you have 5 minutes, Wendy? I can tell you a story about doing that, but
Not really. We have a lot more questions.
My mother was a photographer, and I remember seeing her lots of snapshots and lots of scrapbooks. And I remember as really, I didn't know what was happening, but in the kitchen after dark, she would be developing film or prints in the kitchen. And so she gave me a tiny little Kodak Bantam camera to shoot with when I was in high school, and I didn't really shoot much with it. And it was really when I got to Northwestern and got in the yearbook staff and got into a dark room that it really felt like, I think that was the inspiration, was getting into a dark room and seeing that process. And then as I began to photograph, it was just such a good feeling. So it was that moment of being taken into a dark room by a photographer named Jerry Milks, who took me in and said, "Watch this, a print will appear here in this tray in 30 seconds.
Okay. Other than the Wallace campaign, you were on an assignment where you felt in danger because of the political climate?
Yeah, I was down in Mississippi one time photographing schools, and how the black schools were all the books were bad and the schools were bad and all the separation, and I was really frightened down there. I mean, people followed, pickup trucks followed us around, and they did have guns in the windows, and so I was a physical coward, and I never wanted to get into that kind of problems. But on political campaigns, I mean, I wasn't really afraid on the Wallace campaign, but he was just a nasty guy, you know, and that was that. I can't think of any other time except that one in Mississippi. Yeah, that's about it.
Mary would like to know, what subject matter do you enjoy photographing just for your own interests now?
Oh, now? Well, I guess it's still people. I mean, you know, photographers will get put into a pigeonhole, and they definitely put me in the pigeonhole of photographing people. And that's why I got those assignments to do those interesting people, is because I could get those pictures, and I could make pictures of people that didn't want to be photographed. Now I don't have access to that many people to photograph. And so I try to do landscapes, and I'm terrible at landscapes. They're boring even to me. I mean, they're sharp and the light's beautiful and the colors are beautiful, and I can make great prints from Lightroom, but it just doesn't have the appeal to me. So what I like photographing now is people, and second best is what I have, which is I actually like to photograph where I live. I like to photograph the things around the land I live on, but I'm not a great landscape photographer, or even an interesting landscape photographer.
Barbara would like to know, were you ever surprised when you developed a picture?
All the time. I mean, I'll tell you, if you thought you had made a good picture and you were developing that role, you couldn't wait to get the film developed and dried so you could put a magnifying glass on it and see that you had gotten that picture. So it was, and sometimes you'd find a picture, just like that picture of Daly I was looking at today or a couple of days ago. I always liked the one where he was laughing, and I came up on the other one that was before he was laughing, and I almost like it better. But when I went through that take and I saw the picture of him laughing, I definitely relaxed and said, fine, I screwed up with the 4x5, but I got a good picture of him with the Leica. So yeah, it was great fun to look at a picture that you anticipated and to find it.
Great. What makes a good cover picture? Kathleen asks.
Boy, I don't know. I think, one thing I did wrong, I'll tell you what not to do. And I think you should leave plenty of space around the person. I always shot in that 2:3 35 millimeter frame proportion as to how it looked good in the viewfinder. And then I should have backed up 2 steps to give them more room, because if you looked at some of those life covers, it was almost cutting the person too close to their chin. And so they needed, the Life magazine or the People magazine cover space was not 2:3 proportion. So what makes a good cover is, I don't know, you could say the person not looking at the camera, or you could say the person looking at the camera. So I think it just has to be an appealing picture. And that's the whole magic. Is it appealing or isn't it? Is it interesting or is it not? And I think a cover needs to be pretty simple. And so, the picture of Jimmy and Rosalind wasn't very simple. It was kind of messy. And I think I knew as I was shooting that it wasn't going to be a cover.
Okay. Was there one particular subject who, when they saw your shot of them, did they ever mention to you that you really got them? That's a great question, Mary.
Well, people tell me today, if I go to a book reading and I shoot the person at the microphone, they'll say, that's the best picture I've ever had of myself. Things like that. But I actually got more people to actually write a letter when I worked for the newspaper in Charlotte, and they would write a letter. It was easy because I worked for the big newspaper, The Observer, and they would write a letter. And so I have a lot of those letters, which I intend to burn. But mostly people don't do that. I think maybe in the early days they did, but Candy never said, great shot, Michael, or Paul never said, I think you got the wrong side. I never heard from Alex, although he was just a grand guy and came to town, and I think he did tell me, like, he came to town about a year later and signed books for all the girls. And but people just didn't tend to say that,
Interesting.
Yeah.
What helped you develop your interest and your eye for good shots?
Well, I think it was kind of a flaw that I wanted to make really nice pictures of people. And it would have been a lot more interesting if I'd made pictures that weren't so nice, that weren't so flattering. And so when I was shooting somebody, of course I wanted to make a nice picture, but I wanted to make a picture that represented that person as I perceived them at that moment. And I would push and push and push until I felt I got that part of them and clicked on it, and it was just, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that wasn't them. Maybe it really, but it was what I wanted to get. And that's what I was trying to get. What was the question? I forgot. You forgot too.
No, I'm like reading ahead, and we have a lot of questions still.
Is anybody listening to this, or is just this?
Yeah, there are a few people still here.
Okay.
People are, the ones who are staying are loving it.
Good.
let's see. Did you ever modify any images through Photoshop or some other technology?
Um, yeah, I do all the time for myself, but I will I will try to soften a picture. If I'm shooting somebody and they're older and they look better, a little softer, I'll slide the clarity softer a little to the left. But I hate Photoshop. I like Lightroom. And I hate Photoshop because I don't know how to use it, but it's wonderful for certain things like taking spots out of pictures. And I've never learned to switch heads, but and I really don't. I use Photoshop 5% of the time and not Lightroom 95% of the time, but I do try to enhance a person's image sometimes, but not to the degree that they don't look like themselves, or so soft it looks like the Doris Day filter was on my camera.
Okay. Cynthia would like to know, have photos in magazines changed from today versus how they were done years ago?
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot of retouching going on. I think particularly in the fashion world, there's not a picture that appears in an ad or in an editorial part of the magazine that isn't totally enhanced. And I don't read a lot of magazines today. I look at some car magazines, and some of what they're doing with Photoshop in car magazines is atrocious. It's just really kind of idiotic. But again, I like the photojournalism in Time Magazine and the New York Times, and I don't read a lot of. I do look at the New Yorker, and once in a while, they have an incredible essay. I mean, 3 issues ago, they had a young man shooting in Minneapolis, and it's probably the best protest pictures I saw. He's not a professional photographer. He was an artist, and he just went out and did it. I mean, go back and look at those pictures. And I think those pictures today are better than what we presented back then. I really do, when you see some of those pictures.
Are there any photographers that you admire today?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Philip Montgomery for the New York Times. This young artist whose name I can't remember.
Okay.
Others, I'm sure.
Okay. Here's a comment from Elena. What were your thoughts while shooting the Trappist monks in South Carolina for the book Trappist Living in the Land of Desire?
Well, again, I thought it was an incredible privilege to be there and to have subjects of people that were so special and so different. And my thoughts were, don't be disruptive and be respectful. And yet I said, I'm not gonna, if I'm photographing during prayers or during the services or during 3 a.m. Vespers or whatever, I just walked around. I did not creep around like I was hiding. And so I asked one of the monks I was down there 2 weeks at a time, and I would go back and I would go back and come back. And I said, does it bother you that when I'm taking pictures during sanctuary? And they said, well, it did at first, but then we figured out it was your way of worshiping, which I took as a supreme compliment. And I absolutely love doing that. I went back down this year to photograph some more for them, for their website. And that was a privilege to go back and to see some of these wonderful old guys that I had seen in the 90s.
Great. I think we'll end. Let me just share this story from Kim Siegel. Roy Rowan was my father's contact at Life magazine and R.R. Donnelley in Chicago. The morning following Kennedy's death, Roy received the original blown-up Zapruder film and brought the frames to my father's lab, Standard Studios, Norman Siegel Studios at 417 North State Street. My father worked all weekend producing more than 100 8x10-inch black and white prints of the assassination of President Kennedy for life, November 1963. She adds, I've truly enjoyed your stories behind the photograph.
Well, great.
A comment that was echoed numerous times.
Well, great.
is there anything you'd like to end with to sum up?
Well, I think that, again, I truly thank you, Wendy, for being patient with me and guiding me in how to go about this. And it's very strange to sit here and stare at the screen and think I'm talking to 100 people somewhere, but that's just the way it is now. And actually, you know, I think the pictures were presented better than if we had done it as we've talked about originally a year ago, with slide projectors or with the digital projectors in the center. I think people could see the pictures better, and I think I hope they could. And I think that's one thing I really would appreciate about doing this is that they could see the work. And,
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The idea for this presentation came from Elizabeth David, who works with us at the Levy Senior Center Foundation, and she mentioned to me that her father, Michael, was a former photographer for Life magazine, and he would love to give a presentation. And we spoke, and you developed the presentation, and we've gone back and forth over several weeks, just refining it. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't be here together, but I agree, it was a great way to present your work, and we certainly have reached many more people than you ever would have had you come to Evanston.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I thought if I froze up and couldn't talk, you've looked at the picture so much you could have made the commentary.
Not quite, but
okay.
Almost. But thank you.
All right.
Michael, thank you so much.
All right.
Everyone, thank you for attending today. I will be editing out my my intro remarks at the beginning and uploading the taped presentation to YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow. Next week, we have Patty Lynn coming back, and next week she will be portraying Harriet Beecher Stowe, which should be a very timely and fascinating presentation. I want to give another shout out to Abidor Evanston. Thank you so much for your corporate sponsorship. It's been a tremendous support for us, and we are very appreciative. And I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and have a great week. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.